Welcome to Attainable and Sustainable, Episode 1. The title of today's episode is called Oprah in the Jewish Bedroom. Now, before we hop into today's episode, I'm just going to give a quick synopsis of what this episode is about in case you didn't have a chance to listen to the trailer of this podcast. In any case, it's always good to keep you guys updated what this podcast is about and what you can expect from it. We are all inundated with a buzz of Hollywood love, whether it's part of our daily Instagram scroll or the chatter in the office between colleagues, or simply just standing in the grocery store and seeing the magazine on the magazine stands as it has these big, bold headlines showing us, letting us know who in Hollywood is doing what's going on in their lives. It's all around us. It's been ingrained in us one way or another that Hollywood love is the ultimate love. And it's also been ingrained in us one way or the other that the breakups and the divorces and the disappointments are also inevitable, which leads us, so many of us, to so much confusion. Is love and marriage attainable or sustainable? One may ask, should I even bother with this relationship if statistics and Hollywood, may I add, show that it probably will lead to a breakup or divorce? And that's where I shine the spotlight of the Jewish perspective, which differs somewhat from the Hollywood paradigm, which is exemplified for us all. I've taught this topic since 2010, and I'm constantly amazed how when I engage in conversation with others, Jewish or not, they are surprised or unaware many times of what the Jewish perspective is in terms of relationships and marriage. What does Judaism show us? What does Judaism teach us so that our relationships and marriages can stick and thrive and be exciting as the first day of marriage, and it continues to thrive over time? I want to take a moment to let you know that the goal of this podcast is really to be concise, light, and easy, and just something relatable to listen to as you go about your day. Sometimes people will say to me, I love podcasts, but sometimes they're just too long. I can't commit to an hour. I can't commit to an hour and a half. I'm not always going for a walk for an hour and a half that I can commit to that time, so I just don't end up listening. And I really want this podcast to be relatable in the amount of time that's presented as well. So obviously the podcast episodes will vary in length, but I am aiming for a shorter span of time. All right, hopping into today's episode. Today's episode, like I mentioned earlier, is Oprah in the Jewish Bedroom. So Oprah did a segment a number of years ago on Hasidic Jewish families living in Brooklyn. And why did I choose the first episode to spotlight on Oprah? Because Oprah is the Magul in Hollywood. Oprah is the woman that everyone knows about, and it's a great place to start. She has created an incredible life on television, in Hollywood. The amount of philanthropy that she does is incredible, and she's just an amazing person inside and out. So regarding this segment, she chose a number of Hasidic Jewish families to interview. And one of the families she interviewed was the Ginsburg family. So she walks into the Ginsburg home, a very modest looking home in Brooklyn, with her camera crew, and they show us their beautiful but modest looking home in Brooklyn. They all sit down at the table, and the camera shows Oprah sitting there next to Rabbi and Mrs. Ginsburg and all of their children sitting around the table. I don't remember how many children they had at the time. I'm thinking maybe 9 or 10. A large family, but beautiful looking children sitting around the table. And Oprah's asking them questions about their lifestyle. Oprah's asking them questions about how they differ from the average American family, which has outside influences, which allows TVs in their homes, which allows the children to watch movies. And the Ginsburg children explained to Oprah that they're quite okay with their way of life. They don't feel a need to have those outside influences, and they're very happy with the type of life that they live. One of my favorite parts of the interview was when Mrs. Ginsburg explains something they're sitting there at the table, and she says, as she's explaining the story or explanation of something, she says, and I had a aha moment. And you can see Oprah sitting there looking around like, did anyone else catch that? Because that's my term. And she tells Mrs. Ginsburg, that's my term, and I use it on my show all the time. And Mrs. Ginsburg says, I would never know, because she doesn't watch the Oprah show. But it's quite amazing that it just gets around, whether one watches the show or not. So that was a cute moment. But what I want to get to is when they took the tour of the Ginsburg home. And they take us down the hallway. They show bedrooms to the left. They show bedrooms to the right. And then they come to the master bedroom. And they walk inside. And you see this very modest-looking bedroom. Neat, organized, very modest, very simplistic, with 2 twin-size beds and a crib on the side because they had a baby at the time. And Oprah looks around. And she says, 2 beds? 2 beds? As a married couple, why would you need 2 beds? And Mrs. Ginsburg, Rabbi Ginsburg, they were probably expecting it. So they calmly explain that Jewish tradition teaches that when a woman is menstruating, and this is within the confines of a Jewish marriage, this is not before she gets married, this is within their marriage, she and her husband refrain from sexual intimacy. Now, she goes on to explain that Judaism is aware that we're human. It's one thing to be told not to be sexually active with your spouse, who you're sharing a house with. It's another thing to actually be able to follow these rules. Now, Judaism is aware of the strong attraction between husband and wife. So it set up a buffer zone for us in order to help us out. Sweet, a buffer zone. Now, what is this buffer zone that's created within the Jewish marriage, or what is laid out with that for us in Jewish tradition? That while the woman is menstruating, Judaism says, try to keep an extra level of physical separation if possible. In essence, this piece of information, this piece of direction is a gift to help us attain the seemingly impossible. Okay, you're living under the same roof with a spouse who you clearly love because you got married, who you're clearly attracted to because you chose each other. And Judaism is saying, take a break. She just got her period. Just take a break. No sexual activity until the period is over. Judaism is asking us to be mindful that when you're living in the same place, in the same space, and if you're going to be sharing the same bed, it's very easy to just roll over, engage in hugging and kissing, and say, it's only going to be a hug and a kiss. But we know that inevitably that can lead to more, which is fine because that's supposed to happen. We are supposed to have this attraction, this level of fiery love for one another. And Judaism wants to continue that. And therefore, we create a buffer zone of saying, stop. Stop right here. Take a break. Take a step back. He goes into his space. She goes into her space, meaning physically distance. And then you start to cultivate and create that attraction and that emotion of longing once again. I want to go back to the buffer zone again for a second and just give a couple of examples how we can appreciate this. If a child is, God forbid, diagnosed with diabetes and you know that candy is no good for them, you wouldn't take them into a candy store. You wouldn't expose them to the myriad of sugar levels that's available in a candy store. You just wouldn't do that because you're there to help them make the better decision. Another example, if you're constructing a new home and they're starting with the foundation level, you wouldn't have them create a foundation and dig out the dirt. Start pouring a foundation and start with all the levels of that's created within construction without creating a fenced area around. You, as the homeowner or the one who's in charge of the project, essentially, you wouldn't want to have the liability of accidents on your plate. So you create that buffer zone. You create that fence so people are protected from the construction zone. Another example, if you have a child who has never swam, I'm assuming you wouldn't pop them into the deep end and expect them to keep afloat. Well, actually, I think there are some people who do that, so maybe that's not a good example. But in essence, we see that there are buffer zones all around us in society. And because marriage is so sacred, in order to protect that sanctity, we have a buffer zone within it too. And that's what the Ginsburgs were showing Oprah's audience. This is how we do it in our marriage. We follow the exact recipe that Judaism has laid out for us. And they continue to explain to her how taking breaks of intimacy has kept their marriage afloat and even thriving. So to explain the concept of a break of intimacy within marriage, just to understand that we know that anything that is so amazing, it's too good to be real. It's such an amazing experience that brings you to another realm, such as a sexual experience between man and woman. It can only remain amazing. It can only remain incredible when you have a moment of pulling away and taking a break and feeling the emotion of being away and missing the person, missing the other better half, missing your attraction, missing the love of your life, and feeling that emotion that you want to get together again. I want you to imagine for a moment, just put yourself in this scene that we have all witnessed at one point or another when two people are reunited at an airport. That moment when their separation has come to an end and they're reuniting and embracing in a hug. Okay, so we can all relate with that because either we have experienced it ourselves or we've seen it so many times with others, we know exactly what they're feeling. Or even on the flip side of the coin, when we're witnessing two people hugging at the departure gate because they know that there will be a space of time until they will reunite. They know this is a moment of disconnect and they're having a strong feeling of connection before that disconnect happens until they're able to reunite once again. I heard a beautiful story from Mrs. Goldie Plotkin of Chabad of Markham. Markham is a city in Toronto, Ontario. And Goldie explains that she was once explaining this concept to a woman in her congregation who was engaged, about to be married. And she's giving her a couple of classes explaining the Jewish perspective of marriage and how it could enrich our marriage and our relationship, her relationship. And as she's explaining these concepts to this woman, she's kind of looking not interested. She's looking irritated, and she's looking, she looks like she'd rather not be there. Anyways, Goldie continues the chat. When they finish the class, this woman leaves. She gets on the phone and she calls her fiance, clearly agitated, clearly frustrated. And he says, "What's the matter? What's going on?" And she explains, Judaism has this thing. We take breaks within our marriage. When I get my period, no cussing, no kissing, hugging, no being physically intimate. This is ridiculous. How can Judaism just tell me how to live my life, how my sexual life is going to be within my marriage? And he says, hold on a second. Her fiance happened to be a very well-known therapist in Toronto, very well-known psychiatrist. And he says to her, listen, I want to tell you something. When couples come into therapy and they tell me they're having issues, you know what I tell them? She says, what? And he says, I tell them 2 weeks on and 2 weeks off. You guys want to stay together? You guys have to cultivate this love. You have to cultivate this attraction. You have to work on it. And it will only become precious to you when you take a break within every single month. Make sure you're not sexually active for 2 weeks, and then you get back together and you'll see how good it feels. And he tells her, this is backed in science. This has been practiced by a number of people, and it's very well known. He says, if I tell this to my patients, I am definitely, and we are definitely keeping this concept within our marriage. He was very appreciative that he was actually able to see the source was within Judaism as well. So what was Oprah's aha moment in her show? Oprah gave the Hollywood culture a gift, a small act, which may seem insignificant, but oh, so potent, that when you initially commit to it, it seems like a challenge. Yet when we live with this commitment every single day, every single month, every single year, we reap the benefits in our marriage. So what is the benefit? That at the end of the break from one another, there's a reunion, which is cherished. It's cherished because it was missing for a time period. It's cherished because you're excited to get together with the very person who you were initially attracted to and you took a break from. And now you want to reunite and reignite that love once again. It's kind of like, your expensive diamond ring bedecked with fine jewels, which I'm assuming is not tossed into your cutlery drawer. I'm assuming it's not tossed into your linen closet. I'm assuming it's not put on display next to your picture frames in your living room. Why? Because it's cherished, it's special, and it's a prized possession. I want you to think for a moment of those videos that we can see on YouTube of when deployed soldiers come back home and they surprise their families. I want you to feel for a moment when we see those videos of that initial reunion and the potency of the moment. Why is it so potent? Because there was a separation between the soldier, between the families. There was a barrier. And now that barrier is coming down and they're free to embrace once again. They're free to touch, they're free to feel, they're free to connect once again. And I want to say thank you to Oprah. I want to wrap up this episode by giving thanks and acknowledging the gift and awareness that Oprah gave her listeners and followers. The message that when couples take a short physical break from each other from time to time, it will benefit them. Whether they are Jewish or not, every background and affiliation has a human nature to connect on a deeper level with their spouse. And that connection can happen with anyone with the same vigor or even more when we take that break and we reunite every single month over and over and over again. Next episode's title is going to be My Ectopic Pregnancy Journey, the Non-Hollywood Way. Be sure to check back in 2 weeks' time to hear that full episode. I want to thank you all in advance for listening. And of course, thank you in advance for sharing this podcast with your friends, your family, and colleagues. Be sure to leave a review and send any questions you may have to this podcast, which is also posted on my Instagram page at Your Right to Shine. Thank you for joining this podcast. As always, I welcome your questions, feedback, and support. Be sure to follow me on Instagram at Your Right to Shine. Until next time, continue to be inspired.